next 45 minutes, I'll take you through my PhD dissertation titled Actors, Agency and Politics in Sustainability Transitions, Evolution of the Solar PV Market in East Africa. And my thesis supervisors are James, Ulrich, and Dannemand. Moving on. The agenda for today's thesis presentation, I'll take you through the objective, followed by analytical framework, the knowledge gaps, the overall approach towards conducting this research, followed by 4 articles, and concluding with some cross-cutting findings and contributions. Nearly 600 million people lack access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa, and these electrification rates are among the lowest in the world. These countries are at a critical juncture, and they have to navigate 2 simultaneous transitions, not only towards universal energy access, but also towards low carbon, climate resilient, just transition. There are concerted international efforts and global commitments to achieve these objectives through Sustainable Energy for All, Sustainable Development Goals. There's an overall movement towards reducing reliance on fossil fuels, thermal power, nuclear, and transitioning towards a more sustainable source. And there's a global push towards renewables, also spurred by reduced PV prices, technological advances being made. Within the East African context, and here I specifically refer to the countries which I have covered in my thesis, the electrification rates are well below even the sub-Saharan Africa average. These countries have been one of the fastest growing regions within sub-Saharan Africa, but they also have very low electrification rates. However, they also have one of the highest potential for solar globally. For example, Kenya and Uganda continue to be among the top 5 markets globally for the highest off-grid PV sales. Uganda, for example, over a 2-year period, the total PV pico sales were 2 million units and almost a growth of 135% annually. So we are talking about a huge scale, and they're also continuously or more recently have emerged as a hub for large-scale utility PV projects, counting till now probably a cumulative total of 100 megawatt already installed and many more under pipeline. So the question is, how did this PV market boom? How did this happen? This thesis aims to make sense of this rapidly changing energy market and the role that powerful actors are playing in shaping the transition pathways. But also, as renewables mature, they become competitive, gain ground. The traditional dynamics and the mode of operations also change dynamically, which we aim to explore. So the overall objective of the thesis is to explore the role of actors and agency in driving sustainable energy transitions in the global south. And in this, by actors here, what I mean is transnational actors, which can be broken down into donors, which include development banks, financial institutions, the more traditional ODA assistance, but also corporate foundations, private philanthropy, venture capital, consultancy, global networks, which are also emerging as very important players in this market. The analytical starting point for this thesis is the sustainability transitions literature, which explains the dynamics and processes involved in the diffusion and uptake of technologies and how they co-evolve with the society. It employs a systems approach to understanding change. So change happens not only through technology, but also through actors and networks and institutions. And within this, there are a number of frameworks which explain this process, but one of the most popular ones is the multi-level perspective, which explains how transitions happen through an interplay of niche, regime, and landscape. Niches are protective spaces where innovation and experimentation takes place through private firms, entrepreneurs, innovators, a range of them. Landscape refers to more deeper structural trends, referring to globalization, climate change, a range of factors that put pressure on the regime and opens up windows of opportunity for niche to be taken up. So it mainly represents a reconfiguration of the regime from older unsustainable means to more newer regimes. So transition happens when regimes were not very stable, sufficient pressures this from landscape, and niche innovations are available and ready to take off. However, this understanding becomes more complicated in less institutionalized developing country settings, which we'll discuss later on. Why this framework? Where there are a number of other frameworks also that can explain this entire process. Because it's the structure explain the process. It has a meso-level focus where it looks at this whole change in a more broader perspective within which you can locate the actors and the micro-level interactions that are taking place, not just in isolation. And it also allows for scope to explore these concepts of stability and instability and what is driving change, and more importantly, it allows engagement with more ground realities and complexities as opposed to being a more prescriptive approach. While this concept has evolved quite a lot, there are a number of scholars who continue to identify the ways and need to strengthen it further. And within this literature, a number of studies and academics have urged to adopt more explicit, actor-oriented and politically informed perspective to low-carbon alternative transition pathways. And what this means is more work on actor strategies, multiple roles of actors, transnational influences, politics, power dynamics, because transitions are not neutral processes and they entail actor struggles, competing visions, politics of policy formulations, who tends to frame these transitions and who tends to frame the problems in the first place and how to redress them. So the thesis makes a small attempt to address this call. In order to live up to the overall objective and address some of the research gaps highlighted, I formulated the main research question, which is how do transnational actors and linkages operate and influence the transition to solar PV in East Africa? The overall thesis comprises of 4 articles and a synopsis. And supporting these main research questions are these 4 sub-research questions that correspond to these 4 articles that I've mentioned, which I'll discuss more later during the presentation. But all 4 articles explore the interplay of agency and politics by foregrounding the analysis of and national actors, enabling transitions through case-specific, in-depth studies with an East African context. I employ transition literature, as I've already mentioned, so that's the starting point, that's the basis for the entire thesis. However, I do also borrow from other frameworks in order to support the analysis. In the Article 1, I employ MLP, but also support it with actor-oriented perspective. Article 2, I explicitly borrow from critical policy studies, employing policy transfer and translation concepts. Article 3, employing China-Africa literature concepts on micro-level encounters or frictional encounters. In the Article 4, I again use MLP, but support it with a political economy perspective. So all 4 articles use different frameworks. So it's not a full-fledged agency theory in that sense, but it employs multiple frameworks. Coming to the overall research design, I employ a qualitative multi-case study design. Qualitative case study approach takes motivations and strategies of actors into account, which was considered appropriate for this thesis. It also undertakes a more explorative, in-depth analysis with a basis in context-sensitive and process-related questions. The primary focus was on Uganda. I was pursuing both off-grid and PV grid developments that were taking place. But I also had a peripheral interest to study the growing trend on the utility scale PV segment in the neighboring countries to capture some of the parallel developments and explore some trends. While being cognizant of the fact that these national contexts are significantly different, they have completely different starting points, historical histories, economic and political structure, so it wasn't meant to be a regional perspective. It's not a comparative case study in that sense, but it's a multi-case analysis which takes on multiple data points. So it's investigation of specific phenomenon, but at various locales. This shows the timeline of the entire thesis. The primary data collection took place mostly in 2017 through the scoping phase in early 2017 and the main fieldwork phase later in the year. The overall focus, as I've already mentioned, was on drivers, influencing factors. The scoping phase was conducted to test certain ideas, some preliminary questions, explore availability of data, validate some new developments, also conduct some preliminary interviews and plan for logistics. Interviews were the more important means of collecting the data. Semi-structured interviews, 23 of them collected during the scoping phase and 88 during the main fieldwork phase. The approach was to, for identifying interviewees, the approach was to carry out snowball sampling in order to reach a wider number of stakeholders, followed also in some cases by more purposive sampling, where one could reach out to more critical and irreplaceable set of actors. This was also followed by some focus group discussions that were held across multiple sites, and many informal discussions across workshops, conferences, but also a number of field visits to all utility PV projects that are covered in this thesis, but also many independent distributors, branch offices of private firms scattered across the country. So for example, in Uganda, I traveled a lot around northern Uganda, eastern, southern. I conducted a systematic analysis of data using analytically informed open coding scheme and used a combination of inductive and deductive methods. So I did have a theory and a literature to start with, and I conducted a literature review to guide the thinking and the set of questions and the angles that I could use. But I also relied a lot on the empirical data to actually feed back on what I have studied in the literature. So these are some of the examples of how I try to break down the interview data and to code some of them, but also to come up with certain patterns which could then be validated through the theoretical themes and cross-check with some of the concepts and validate them. Okay, sorry. So till now we've talked about what the objective of the thesis is, what are the research questions, how did I approach it, how did I design it, and now moving on to the main content, which is the articles, the 4 articles. The first article is published in Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions journal. And the main question that it tries to address is, how did off-grid PV solar in Uganda evolve from the early 1980s to 2017? And more importantly, within this, what kind of a role did transnational actors play, or how did they drive the entire transition through mobilizing key resources? And the approach that I took was to obviously go through a lot of secondary data, but conduct interviews, document events, programs, projects, initiatives that have been implemented in Uganda since the early 1980s, prepared an inventory of all the projects, curated them to identify which were the more critical ones based on the feedback from experts, and identified 3 different phases of the PV diffusion process, and I'll talk about them as we go. And also developed a typology of what do we mean by transnational actors, or who among them were the more critical, with the intention to unpack the actor roles, their motives, the power dynamics that entailed, and also discuss a bit around how did these traditional roles change, or how did new actors take over, how did the overall modus operandi among these actors also evolve. Starting with the typology, I disaggregated the transnational actors beyond just what we call the donors. This is a more simplified version of what is in the article. But the intention was to also include a whole range of new actors that have been operating, including consultancies, private philanthropy, industry associations, some of the global networks. But I would also like to take a moment to re-emphasize, while the intention was to disaggregate transnational actors, if you actually look at it, a chunk of it still represents the donor community. I mean, that'd be the more traditional aid organizations or the UN organizations, multilateral development banks, international financial institutions. So while I will use this term transnational actors throughout this presentation, but keeping in mind that obviously donors continue to be the more critical chunk, whereas a whole set of actors are also a part of it that have contributed to this transition. Just to give one example of this organization called Solar Sister, that they're partnering with, for example, a university, intergovernmental organization, UN, a more traditional donor, a global network, Clinton Foundation, a lot of private philanthropy. So it's also beyond a point very difficult to actually say whether it's a private firm, whether it's an NGO. There are hybrid partnerships. They're operating in a very complex way, which you cannot even say whether it's only grant funding, donor funding anymore. So I reconstructed the historical timeline of how PV evolved, and okay, the whole thing is missing. Starting from the early 80s, where it was an emergence phase. The initial PV use started because to store for cold storage for vaccines refrigeration. This was part of the national immunization program that began in early 80s. Moving to small-scale scattered NGO and church-based projects to more formal, planned, long-term projects, pilot projects that began with government and UNDP, moving to more local companies, which are not even renewable companies, but they start to explore foray into this market, and then the entry of more large-scale Dutch foundation, large-scale multinational firms that enter later in the 2000s, but take a huge market share. So we look at these three different phases and how they evolve. Some of the points which I have already kind of mentioned in terms of from experiments, need-based to more planned interventions, small-scale scattered projects to more long planned rural electrification projects, church and diaspora and word-of-mouth networks to more organized projects, local firms to multinational firms taking a whole range of innovative financing on board, and hybrid partnerships and networked operations. And just to give you some statistics on early 80s to late 2000s, and gathered from a whole range of different projects implemented across time. But this doesn't even include some of the trade data. This doesn't include independent distributors. This does not include over-the-counter sales of PV products. So what this means is that this is not an exhaustive list or data, but it's representative. But you can see the last phase where it kind of shoots off quite significantly. This is where a large chunk of multinational firms and the market scales up, basically. So overall, some concluding thoughts. Most of these projects were being implemented because there was capital available, because there was technology, and because there was knowledge from a range, mobilized by a range of transnational actors, the list we've just discussed. And because they were mobilizing these resources, they could also opt for certain preferences, certain values, and could also exercise power in many ways over and above the national actors. Overall, we see that this transition somewhere also manifests the changes that happen in the larger political development aid discourse, where it moves from the more traditional donor base to a lot more market-driven. The DFIs, the financial institutions' role expands a lot more. They become very much more competitive. The donors' role shrink to some extent, that they become mediators to support this whole private sector drive. Article 2 is published in Energy Policy, and it looks at how global ideas are mobilized at a local level by a set of actors and taking on experiences from the wider international networks. So we use the case of GetFit, which is a policy program, and employ the policy translation approach. The overall approach was to look at the archival documents, a lot of annual reports, World Bank reports, to come up with a history of how this program and the policy was conceptualized, develop a timeline within the country context of all the historical events that led up to this policy program and what was the need for it, undertook a purposive sampling with strategic set of actors that were involved in this entire policy formulation, and then focus on the specific actor accounts, their interests and strategies, and how they draw on the wider networks and experiences to implement this policy, which was, So the intent is to not look at just the policy outcomes, but to see how the background processes behind the policy led to this policy taking shape. I'll quickly take you through the timeline or sequence of events historically which led to this policy taking shape, which led to renewable energy projects. The overall context in Uganda is that in the late 90s and early 2000s, Uganda liberalized and privatized its electricity sector. It's one of the first countries in Africa to do that. As part of that, a new Electricity Act was born, regulatory authority was shaped, new institutions were formed. Most of this was with the idea that it would lead to more private sector investments within the electricity sector. However, in the early to mid 2000s, there were also, the country also suffered many droughts and consecutive droughts, because of which, so to go back a little bit, Uganda is quite dependent on hydropower as its main electricity source, followed by some thermal power and PV and bagasse projects. But that was the time when they were solely dependent on hydropower, which were due to consecutive droughts they couldn't, and there was vulnerability around it. So they had to figure out a way to come up with to diversify the energy mix, and that's why we see the feed-in tariff policy program that was initiated as part of the Energy Policy 2007, but both feed-in tariff phase 1 and phase 2 did not lead to any projects. So then there was this whole idea of, so why is that? I mean, you have the feed-in tariffs, the private sector, the electricity sector has been liberalized, the private sector should just take off. I mean, that was the initial idea, that all the elements are in place, so why did this not lead to any projects? And then, guided and steered by the Electricity Regulatory Authority, they started looking into this problem of maybe we need to look beyond just the feed-in tariff instrument or just the tariff rate and need to address the issues at large. We're talking about institutions which are barely even a decade old. Uganda has already suffered financial issues with utility. There are off-taker payment risks, there are currency risks, there are exchange risks. So naturally, it wasn't just about the tariff rate, but the need was to look at a set of risks up front. So Uganda introduced a new feed-in tariff program in 2013, which was developed originally by Deutsche Bank from a European standpoint, based on long-standing evidence that feed-in tariffs have not fared very well in sub-Saharan Africa. Although they've been introduced in many countries, they've been in place, but they haven't been very effective or have led to many projects. And a sequence of events led to Uganda becoming the first country to localize, implement, get fit in real. With the sole objective in order to fast track the development of privately financed grid-connected small-scale renewables. It was driven entirely initially by the Electricity Regulatory Authority that found a need for this and also was very critical in developing some of the rough ideas behind this program, followed by exchanges with KfW and Deutsche Bank, which played a critical role in developing this program in Uganda, followed by a range of donors, financial institutions that were backing this program in the entire implementation process. So what did this program contain? One, top-up donor subsidy over and above the feed-in tariff rate. There was a need to increase the rate and subsidize, simplify the enabling environment, de-risk investments for private sector, which became very critical, technical assistance for the regulatory authority to take all of this on board and standardize all these processes, and ultimately also experiment setting up solar PV projects, large scale. The overall process entailed disagreements and complex, messy process with regard to a number of issues concerning tariff rate, concerning tax reforms, which would have hampered the influx of private firms, differences between World Bank, KfW with regard to instrument preferences and ideologies. Solar PV was not even part of the program, but was brought on board later on, mainly driven by ERA, but also because of the support of the EU ambassador, because most of the projects, in total there were 17 projects under this policy program implementing. Most of the projects were micro-hydro or bagasse, which micro-hydro in particular took a longer time to actually get constructed. But they realized that solar PV takes a much lesser time, and so it was more politically appealing to implement them while the other projects are under construction. And a number of this messiness could only also be handled because ERA played a central role in this entire process, the regulatory authority, which had the political leverage, also was clear from the very beginning on building domestic capacities. While the overall focus of the policy was on generation, they missed out on a critical factor, which was distribution and transmission and distribution. So they did not negotiate or work with the Uganda Transmission Company, which led to a number of hydro projects concentrated in one particular region, which would overload the grid substation, which means idle generation for the utility. And obviously they wouldn't want that because that means bankruptcy for the utility. So the project was almost about to be stalled when FID came with more funding to build the transmission and distribution infrastructure from the very beginning. In short, the point is that the whole policy translation that we talk about was a very process that was not very straightforward and entailed negotiating, compromising, managing a whole range of stakeholder relations across a wide spectrum. And this was also possible by drawing on experiences, influences from KfW's fund management, but also multi-donor programs, the investment committees and independent experts, which were sort of exclusionary because they were drawn from the experiences of the KfW Energy Sector Advisor. And some elements from the South African auction program. Uganda is the second auction program in the sub-Saharan Africa. And the overall secretariat being based within the electricity regulatory. In conclusion, the program implemented 17 projects, in total 160 megawatts, of which there were 2 PV projects of 20 megawatt. The program overcame path dependency of large utility scale projects to implement small scale 20 megawatt projects and made it possible. It capitalized on the strengths of transnational actors such as KfW, World Bank, networks and experiences within Deutsche Bank, and ERA gave it a leadership role. The regulatory authority gave it legitimacy and clout within the energy sector. So in total, it was steered by probably a handful of 5 or 6 people at the end of the day, but very strategically skilled and positioned actors. Moving on, Article 3 is not yet published. It's under the revise and resubmit status in the Geoforum journal. Furthering transnational actors that we've been talking about, taking this to another direction of China as the transnational actors, not the donors anymore. So China is a rising power in Africa. The political rhetoric of China-Africa green cooperation is gaining momentum, which has been attributed mainly to a saturated domestic market in China and increasing competition in European and US markets. This paper aims to reveal the micro-level relations and encounters and conflicts around a PV project by Chinese in Kenya, implemented by Chinese. It reveals how discontent is gradually accumulated among the local communities due to their expected benefits of the investment not realized. Overall, we see that China's investments in Africa across hydro, wind, and solar has increased significantly. But there's very scarce data in terms of what does this mean. I mean, there are many versions of it being in terms of geopolitical shifts and a whole larger negative narratives around it, but very little evidence from on-the-ground specific in-depth case studies. So the interest was to look into one project implemented in Kenya, which is called the Garissa project, 55 megawatts, which entails not just Chinese loans from the Exim Bank, but also EPC contractor, all the technology, Jinko Solar, and a range of workers and experts from China. The overall project was conceived in 2012, but delayed due to various tariff negotiations leading up to 2016, and 2017 is when the final construction began. But where is Garissa? I mean, where is this project located? It's in northeastern Kenya, bordering Somalia, 400 kilometers from Nairobi, and is constantly characterized by armed conflicts, heavy military presence, and restricted movement of people. Why did this project set up here? Because of constant power cuts, power outages, and long transmission lines from Nairobi to all the way to Garissa. So the interest was to strengthen the regional grid substation that also further connects with the northern Kenyan region. So overall approach was to first follow secondary data, which was very sparse. There was no coverage on this project, coverage. And I was in Kenya, so I was having these discussions with a range of government stakeholders around utility PV sector. I even spoke with some of the private PV owners that were very frustrated with the Kenyan system of not supporting the utility PV projects, negotiating with the regulator for almost 5 years, whereas there was very little information on what was happening on this project, which was already on the ground and construction was underway. So I did some interviews with REA, which is the Rural Electrification Authority in Kenya, which owns this project, and energy department staff, the engineers, and that's when I realized the status of the project, that it was under construction. And the very next day, I went to the site, conducted this 2-day site visit with their social manager, communications manager, cum liaison staff. And it was not possible to visit the site without having that government vehicle with us the entire time. So some of my interviews, some of the data obviously is filtered through REA. but it was very difficult to do it without them, or there was no other access. And even organizations like GIZ or even Strathmore Energy Research Center in Kenya did not have much information on what was happening about this project. So I conducted some interviews on the ground with project managers, with a few workers, and a focus group discussion with the local community to find out more around their community engagement, perceptions, conflicts, and concerns. This is some of the initial photographs from the project construction. That's the general landscape, base structure for the panels being prepared, and some office buildings being constructed around late 2017. So in total, the approach that we used is called frictional encounters or micro-level encounters, and we focused on two themes or two aspects to elucidate these interactions between Kenyan and Chinese actors, which was local community development and local jobs. Within the community development, we looked at the engagement aspects starting from the land. The project was under pastoral land, and the ownership was community owned, which remained unresolved, and there was no compensation being paid throughout the entire process, or there was not much discussion going on, which was building a lot of frustration among the local communities. Further adding to that frustration was that they only saw Chinese employees being present on the project, and we're talking about a semi-arid, very sparse population, rural, remote location where suddenly you have this massive infrastructure, boundary wall created, and a number of construction going on, completely dominated by Chinese employees. And over a period of time, but you have to remember this is a very simplified version. The details are in the articles if this interests you. So I'm obviously cutting down on the entire nuance of how the project unfolded. But in short, it led to a lot of dissatisfaction, and there was an attempt by the community to break a part of the boundary wall, as a result of which they brought in a REA liaison manager for the first time. So there was a REA representative who came on board and was present on site, a Kenyan who could speak a Kenyan Somali language, because most of the demographic was a mix of Kenyan Somali people, which then managed their expectations and their concerns, which wasn't very tangible. It was more coming from this entire notions and perceptions around the project. Overall, REA was very sensible about the fact that the project has to have certain social license, social acceptance, so they wanted to work with the community around them and created a representative committee. But this entire process also was very political. It was politicized even by the local county politics, and there were different iterations of what would be the community activities. And the overall community representative that was formed primarily was dominated by the local county officials. But just to kind of give an example, followed by local employment, which was one of the more critical issues. Community expected direct benefits, more industries, more jobs, enhanced skills as part of this project. But the reality was that the promises were pretty hyped in terms of 1,000 jobs to be created. But in reality, during the construction phase, about at the max 250 to 300 local Kenyans were employed. But mostly in unskilled and some in semi-skilled activities. The unskilled, mostly masonry, building the office, doing the construction work. And semi-skilled activities entailed some electrical works, steel works, handling some of the machinery. But one of the other problems was also all of these workers were pretty much day wagers, and there was no formal contracts with any of these workers, and there were no wage assurances or medical benefits. The entire focus of the EPC contractors, the Chinese contractors, was that efficiency has to be the high, which also means costs and timeline. They had to implement a 55 megawatt project within a 1-year timeline. So given that, you could see in the photos, they were mostly JCB machines, drilling machines. The entire interest was to reduce the manpower. And some of the other interview expressions that cannot be categorized into any of these boxes were like just the fact that a boundary wall creates certain exclusion for pastoralists who have always been used to free movement also brings in certain vulnerabilities among this community and certain perceptions from the Chinese side in terms of they were vulnerable in ways that they are working in a very high-risk border area and they weren't able to move around outside the project boundary. So those couldn't come inside the project boundary. So the interest of this article was to look at how the global that we talk about, whether the China, the resources, the finances, the technology, the infrastructure, how that get entangled with very specific notions and local institutions. The initial ideas were formed by reading and reviewing a lot of the China-Africa literature, which includes narratives around the fact that how Chinese investments in African countries are kind of becoming a new form of colonialism, and also they're taking all these countries into massive debt traps. They do not follow the environmental and social safeguards, mostly employ Chinese workers. So the entire intent was to also validate all these assumptions that are around the Chinese investments in the African countries. And we find that there is a high proportion of Kenyan workforce that was employed, even though they were mostly low-skilled. And many of the Chinese workers that were employed within this project were not coming directly from China. They're pretty much being recycled as part of a lot of these bundled project deals that China has with a lot of these African countries. So they're coming already with experience of many years in Northern and Western Africa. But there was limited local development co-benefits because most of the technology, the equipment, the knowledge, the skills were completely imported. And it's an open discussion in terms of was this a missed opportunity for REA, for example, that could have at least involved a local university, a local NGO, local organizations, or use this as an opportunity to build some of the domestic technological capacities in the process. Moving on, Article 4. It investigates another case of utility scale PV project in Rwanda. We looked at a PV project in Kenya, Chinese investment. This is Rwanda, mostly again going back to development finance institutions as an investment. This was the first project in East Africa and one of the most quickly built. Just to give a bit of history, Rwanda has been on a pretty high wave of economic development. Their energy demand has been significantly high, but the entire development phase has also been fairly new, or more recent in terms of ever since the genocide, there was an entire attempt to rebrand the image of Rwanda and be on the wave of economic development, attract international finance and private investments. So who were these drivers of this 9 megawatt project implemented in Rwanda, the first in East Africa? It started with a youth village that were hosting youth from genocide who did not have families, and they had a huge parcel of land, who got in touch with one of the founders of Gigawatt Global, a Dutch company that invests in renewable energy projects, and Scatec Solar, a Norwegian company, is operating the project. And it's mainly funded by development finance institutions like FMO, Norfund, but also some equity investments from Scatec. So we know a bit about the fact that Rwanda has been pursuing this private sector participation and investment, and there have been many deliberate efforts to create an enabling environment and put incentives in place for private firms. Unlike what we've seen in Uganda's case, which was one of the first to liberalize their sector, which was in late 1990s, Rwanda only opened up their electricity sector to private firms in late 2000, so almost 2 decades later. So we're talking about and this project was implemented in 2014. So in total, ever since they opened up their sector to privatization, it's been less than 5 years when this project was implemented. So they went very aggressive on a whole range of policies, incentives, schemes, preparing their institutions to actually be on board to take on competitive bidding. They gave exemptions for PV imports. They had an entire investment code in place, a whole development board. So we see a lot of very strategic but planned, organized, aggressive kind of move towards attracting private sector, not a very slow growth, not a very gradual. And what this means is that it highlights how the overall Rwandan government operates, but more importantly, how the president operates. And this is one quote which kind of sums up the whole thing in terms of the aggressiveness of the overall government. There's a very strong top-down approval and led to a very fast contract negotiation process of the whole project. It's pretty much, while there are many institutions that have been set up, but it's ruled by one leader, and with the ambition of transitioning Rwanda into a middle-income country. And also sending signals. This was the first project in East Africa. It's also sending a signal that can implement a project and show it to the world that this is possible. It's a technocratic, authoritarian government. There are many names to what this government is. This is one kind of a categorization which has been both praised for its aggressive developmental ambition, but also been criticized from many other aspects in terms of human rights, suppression of free speech, repressed political dissent. But this project was on the good side of the government and the politics in terms of it was adding to the economic development. And in conclusion, we again see the importance of development finance for an expertise to be able to bring this project to realize it. But it also needed state leadership and decision making and expediting the whole process. I mean, if it opened up to the electricity, to the private sector in late 2000s, they made way for a whole range of regulations being taken off so that this project could be implemented. Whereas in Kenya, when I was speaking to the utility scale PV firms, for 5 years almost, they were just dealing with regulations and the regulatory hurdles of all kinds, whereas this project was implemented within 6 months after the negotiations took place. So a lot of aggressive mechanisms to attract private sector, which was good for the project. Is it a niche? I mean, it's a new project. It's the starting of the whole solar PV transition within the utility scale segment, but this is the only project. 2019, 5 years, there hasn't been any other project ever since. So is it a niche or is it only a pilot? But despite being a pilot, it did lead to far-reaching changes in the regime in terms of easing the whole regulation, standardizing, streamlining policies to a large extent. So it did lead to something. Okay. Cross-cutting findings. So we've looked at the overall how research was conducted, designed, and in the Article 1, we saw how transnational actors drove the off-grid PV in Uganda. In the Article 2, we saw the complementary roles played by both transnational and national actors to enable the Get Fit policy program in Uganda. In the Article 3, we saw how Chinese as a transnational actor implemented this project, but what kind of co-benefits did it lead to in Kenya? And in Article 4, we looked at the actors and institutions in the political context and the development authoritarian state in Rwanda. So different kinds of transnational actors and different forms of driving transition. Overall, my research points to 3 key empirical insights. First, the more obvious one, social actors and linkages were carried out most of the important niche and regime activities, which entailed mobilizing resources such as technology, capital, knowledge, networking with a wide range of actors, changing, adapting, working with institutions, advocating, and lobbying. This also entailed, the whole energy market also entailed new set of actors like China and bundled, packaged model of projects, but it also entailed changing roles of the traditional donors, expanding roles of private firms, development finance, private philanthropy becoming really huge, as well as venture capital, but more importantly, all of them operating in a very hybrid format. And the third important point, that despite all of that, the leadership role of the national government was critical in expediting, enabling, steering, and legitimizing these transitions. So there were very different forms of leadership that was exercised, with the Electricity Regulatory Authority in Uganda versus Kagame in Rwanda versus Rural Electrification Authority in Kenya. But we also, given this, should not miss out, and the thesis kind of brings out, highlights the nuances of this agency being exercised by a range of, not just national, but a range of subnational and local actors. And taking a step back, I began with the fact that I employed sustainability transitions literature, MLP framework as the starting point. I highlighted the fact that change in regime occurs through niche, innovation, and landscape. And this is as part of a review that I conducted initially during my thesis, in terms of how the whole understanding of actors and agency has been within the MLP framework, and also how it has changed or evolved across a number of studies and scholars. And the scope has widened quite a lot, and it involves a range of different actors, policy actors, intermediaries, NGOs, but somehow the notions and the overall categories are still referred to as niche actors, regime actors, and to some extent landscape, not so much as actors, but certain actors that instantiate landscape processes. So where do transnational actors fit into this entire scheme of the MLP and the actor conceptualization? Are they niche actors? Are they regime actors? Do we engage with the whole transnational actors? I mean, do we try to box them into these more stereotypical categories, or do we try to expand these categories? These within the more traditional MLP framework are categorized as external actors, external to the national system. But in reality, they play a very critical and central role to carry out all of these niche and regime activities. So where do they feature and how do they operate? What we see for the transitions literature is that unlike the initial conception of more nationalistic or national-based innovation systems and transitions, we see that transition occurred through a more multi-scalar phenomena, that regimes are indeed more globally embedded than previously assumed, that landscape needs to be better elaborated, and overall transnational linkages are extremely important to study transitions in the global south. The overall contributions from a research perspective is that it uncovers transnational dimensions of energy transitions, illustrates how agency and power is exercised within new empirical contexts, and from a policy perspective, it reinstates the importance of local leadership to prioritize intentional engagement with transnational actors, and how exploiting windows of opportunity could strengthen domestic capacities and technological learning. But why is it important to study actors? Because actors create, adapt, influence change processes at its very core. The transitions can be tracked back to the strategic interventions of few actors at the end of the day. They strategize, they manipulate, they lead, they could fast track, they could choose any of these options to steer transitions. But also in the process, they struggle, they have contestations, and they mobilize resources. But all of this helps us to assess the conditions under which the transitions are being realized, and whether and how fast a particular transition will develop. So given then this research has been conducted, this thesis has been conducted, so what next? I mean, one of the most important thing is the question mark that I asked, where do transnational actors feature within the larger transitions literature? There's a need to conceptualize actors and agency in a more explicit theoretical way, but also look more closely at this changing role of the traditional donors. So that's one project that I plan to embark on. And the other being that most of these large-scale utility PV projects that we see in the past couple of years that are being implemented across many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, spurred by both feed-in tariffs but also driven by auction programs. What are the developmental co-benefits of these projects? How are they operating in silos? How are they embedded within the local context? Is it an equitable, just transition? Thank you.